Welcome back to Neurodiverse Christian Couples, as here we are in our 2025 season. I'm one of your hosts, Stephanie Holmes.
Hi, and I'm the other one, Dan.
That's Dan. And if you are new to our show, we are a neurodiverse Christian couple. Our adventure into autism began in 2005, 2006, when our eldest daughter was diagnosed. Our youngest daughter is ADHD, and Dan was identified in 2019. So we began to shift our focus and help to marriage and families who have neurodivergencies of many kinds. And we are super excited to have as our guest today, Dr. Curt Thompson. Thank you for being here on the show with us.
Well, goodness, Stephanie and Dan, it's a pleasure. And as we were saying just before we started, it's also just very humbling and an honor. And I'm grateful for the opportunity and love that your listeners have you out in the field doing the work that you're doing. So thanks be to God, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the podcast.
We have been really diving into your material, and we think it's going to be so helpful to our listeners. But listeners, if you don't know who Dr. Thompson is, he is a board-certified psychiatrist, author, speaker, and co-host of the Being Known podcast. I actually found Dr. Thompson on NeuroFaith. He was doing an interview with Dr. Wilder, and you guys know we do a lot of stuff on Dr. Wilder on this show. He's in private practice for over 30 years. He strives to help patients develop flourishing lives by telling their stories more truly in order to become more deeply known for the purpose of creating beauty and goodness in the world. So you operate as a psychiatrist, and I really love that you bring in the dialect of interpersonal neurobiology and Christian anthropology. So we are here today because our clients deal with a lot of shame and a lot of trauma. And so I'm going to let Dan kind of start off with his first question. We both had different ones of your books that we've been studying for to have you on the show. So Dan, where would you like to start the conversation today with Curt?
Well, I think the first place to start is let's get a definition of shame, because reading through the book, it was a better perspective. I remember, I guess it was an added layer. I remember you take a Jim Wilder perspective. Shame is, if joy is I'm happy to see you, shame is the opposite. I want to run away. It's a fear kind of response. So two pieces in that one, and maybe I'll jump too far ahead, but would you give us your perspective on defining shame, and then tell us how come you believe you can only overcome it in a community? It is not something you overcome by yourself.
Yeah, well, I think Dan, one of the first things I tried to be explicit about this in the book. I don't so much talk with people about shame having a definition as we describe it in motion. We describe its activity. In that, the first thing I think it's important for our listeners to have a sense of is that if we say like I feel ashamed of, fill in the blank, whatever it is. Everybody who's listening, we all kind of have an idea about what we mean. There's something that feels bad, but it's also some idea that we have in our mind. It's this: I'm ashamed that I didn't do that well enough, or that I committed that act, or whatever these things are. It's a feeling, but it's also a cognition and so forth. But what we first want to highlight is that shame, before anything else, it's a neurophysiological event before it's anything. That it is an embodied and brained event that eventually, and of course, it happens very, very quickly when we experience it. We all kind of know what that means, but there are some defining features of it. One of the first things that we recognize is that it is a phenomenon that can begin to occur in human beings as early as 15 to 18 months of age. Now, when we say what's important about this, of course, is that we don't have a 15-month-old saying to us, "Mom, I feel really ashamed about what just happened. I just discovered, walking through the kitchen naked gave me this felt sense of shame as a 15-month-old." They're not going to be telling us this, I think, for the most part. But we see it in 15 to 18-month-olds, right? We notice the turning away, and so what do we see and what do we sense in our bodies? The first thing we have this sense is that shame is a feature in which we literally physically tend to turn away from others. We turn away from a gaze. But we also want to tend to turn away from our own internal personal awareness of what it is that's happening. I'm trying to escape the feeling, the sensation that is taking place with me. So there is, first of all, there's a turning away from, which is important, especially when it comes to the other significant part of this that we get to when it comes to the storytelling that we attach to shame. And so there is a turning away. There is a what we would call a disintegration. When we feel ashamed of things, if we say like, oh, when you feel ashamed, how eager are you to want to have a conversation with somebody right now when you're feeling ashamed? No, I don't want to do that. How easy is it for you to create? How easy is it for you to think clearly? How easy is it for you to take risks when you feel ashamed? All these things, there is a certain disintegrating effect that the shame has. My thinking brain and my feeling brain and my imaging brain, these things tend to get disintegrated, decreated, decoupled away from what we would call in the field of interpersonal neurobiology an integrated state, or what Jesus would call living wholly, perfectly, even as our Father in heaven is also perfect, even is also complete. It's incomplete, it's separated. The other thing then that happens is that people will find themselves being isolated. This isolation, this turning away is not temporary. I tend to turn away from you. I tend to turn away from the thing in my mind that is creating this sense, this thing that happened. I don't want to think about it. I want to bury it. So I want to escape from parts of me as I'm escaping from you. And so the disintegration is taking place both between me and others and within me and other parts of myself. So this disintegration takes place, and then these things become isolated. And then we move to this place of stasis. Now, what I invite readers in The Soul of Shame to consider is that one of the things that evil is about, evil is not just about, I mean, when we say evil is about corrupting the good in the world, that evil is parasitic, evil is destructive, evil is, it's not a thing in and of itself as much as it is a force, a personality or so that is trying to kind of just, it maps onto that which is good and devours it. It's important to know that one of the ways that evil wields shame is by keeping us, it's not just that we feel bad. It's not just that I have some sense that I'm not enough, but it has this sense of keeping me from creating, keeping me from moving. If the mission of us as image bearers of God is to be agents of creating beauty and goodness in the world, if that's my mission, this is page 1 of the Bible. And one of the things that shame does in my isolation and stasis, it keeps me stuck in places in which I can now no longer move and then create beauty and goodness in the world. And then the cognitive feature of this is one in which, and we're all familiar with this, I should have done this, I should have done that, I'm such a this, I'm such a that. It's one of condemnation. The cognitive posture that emerges, my thinking brain, the story that I tell with words, not just the images, but the story that I tell with words is one of condemnation, the outgrowth of all of which is this sense that I'm being left alone with myself, with my shame. And this, of course, is the antithesis of the second page of the Bible, where we read when God says, it's not yet complete. It's not okay that the man is alone in the way the man is. Like, the aloneness is not okay. We're going to do something about that. We're going to finish the job. And so this notion of separating to come together, taking a rib, bringing the woman to the man, coming together as differentiated yet linked parts is what flourishing looks like. Shame is all about the opposite of that when it's wielded by evil. When wielded in a disintegrating way, it deconstructs, it disintegrates, it keeps us out of our capacity to create. And this felt sense of abandonment is speaking back into the very first couple of pages of the book of Genesis. And that's all long-winded, therefore, like, it's not just a definition, but it tells us a little bit more about like what we see in people, what we experience internally when we know that shame is active and on the move.
Is the way that played out, you went through a very neurological perspective and all that, how much of that just happens? We're not, just like we breathe. We're not thinking breathe, 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 breathe. Of that cycle of events, is that an automatic kind of process going on at a shame? We sense a shame, and then our body reacts.
In many respects, it is. This is why to me, okay, the writers of the biblical narrative are just off the chain. I mean, these cats are like, it's unbelievable. Like, how is it that in the third, at the end of the second page of the Bible, we read the Hebrew writer say, and the man and his wife were naked and unashamed? How do they say that? They could have said they were naked and happy, they were naked and unafraid, they were naked. They were lots of it. But the Hebrews had lots of words. But they pick a word that is also, as it turns out, neurobiologically very, very primal to our experience neurodevelopmentally. And the reason that is important is that, we like to talk about like the state, the thing that we call guilt, for instance, the state of mind that we call guilt. It is suggested in most research that doesn't really start to emerge. A child's capacity for experiencing the thing that we give that word to doesn't emerge before the kid is about 3 to 5 years of age. It comes later because I have to have a more fully developed middle prefrontal cortex in order for that to even begin to emerge. So to your question, yeah, shame starts, and I start to sense it pretty automatically without my current awareness of this. And it's also, I think, important for us to recognize that, this notion that we are having things happen automatically is children come into the world. Shame in and of itself is a signal. Shame is not a problem in and of itself. Shame is a signal. Our problem is, how do we respond to it? And when children first start to show signs of this, the real question is, when the parents see the signs, which often, as John Bradshaw famously talked about early on, now 30 years ago or more, the early senses of it is, it's a certain sense of shyness. It's a certain sense of like embarrassment. I sense in my body and so forth. But the real question is then, how do we respond to it? Adam and Eve, when they started to sense it, and I would argue that we can see that this starts to emerge long before any fruit gets eaten in that story. That the question is, what do we do in response to our shame? And this is why you asked the question about, like, how do we heal? We don't heal all by ourselves. That sense of being isolated from within myself and my turning away means that I actually have to have somebody else come to find me if my shame is going to be healed. I'm not going to do this even neurologically by myself. So by the time I'm 3, 4, 5 years of age, I already have lots of neurobiological practice experiencing shame. The real question is, in the course of my being in the family that I'm in, how has that family system helped me respond to it when we all sense and see that it's happening? And it's not just me sensing shame in myself. I'm also going to be watching it happen in other family members. I'm going to be learning not just because of what I sense in my body, but also because of what I observe in the system that I will also sense, but it's also because of something that I'm seeing outside of myself. And this is why, again, this whole notion of God formed a man out of the mud of the earth. We have bodies, and he breathes the breath of life into man's nostrils, and man becomes a living being. There is this sense of soul, this sense of spirit, this sense of animation that is taking place that is quite mysterious and beyond our capacity to define that scientifically. That's deeper than just, my body, so much more than just my body. But there is the sense in which there is a sequence in how creation happens. I have an embodied experience, and then I have to make sense of what my embodied experience tells me. And so, yes, shame does emerge as an embodied thing, but then begins to be shared relationally, because I experienced it in my body, but it's because I saw the glance in your eye, I saw the look of contempt, or I heard the voice, the tone of contempt in your voice, and so forth and so on. So it begins in the body, it gets automatically practiced there. And so part of what it means for us to heal from shame means, how do other people help me draw my attention to where it's showing up in order for me then to make different decisions in responses to it. That's all very long-winded. Sorry.
No, so I want to ask then, like, there's maybe a healthy shame, or what we might call guilt or conviction, that we do something that's like, oh, I shouldn't have said that, I shouldn't have done that. that can bring us to, so I need to repair, or I need to go to that person and, confess what I've done. And then there's the kind of unhealthy, toxic shame. It's like, I'm bad, I'm never going to get any better. Kind of walk through those differences of when you're experiencing a healthy, to bring us to conviction and back to relationship. And how do you know it's unhealthy or toxic or damaging to your person?
Right. It's a great question. And I think, again, to emphasize that shame in and of itself, it would appear to be, it's a signal. It tells us something. And the real question is, what do we do in response to the signal when it shows up? There are things, Stephanie, there are things that we humans do in the world for which shame is absolutely the appropriate response. Things that we do, I do something, and for which, like, it is a good thing that I would be ashamed of the thing that I do, the thing that I did. But it is also important to know that, like, we don't believe that God put shame into the system as a signal, simply as a way to rub our noses in things that we've done. It is a signal, and therefore the question, now how do we respond? And so we would say that in some respects, like, it's not so much is there healthy shame or unhealthy shame. The question is, are there healthier or unhealthier responses to shame? When we have, like, what are the behaviors what are the things that we want to be doing when shame shows up? And one of the first things we would say is that we want to pause and be curious about, well, what's actually happening in the room? Is there something that I've done? I want to be curious about, is there something that I've done for which actually, yeah, I really hurt your feelings when I said that in front of the other people. I said something that hurts your feelings, and, like, that's not okay. Like, that's not the behavior. That's not the behavior that is good for you, for me, for the people who heard it. And so then I'm going to have to weather that, because when I become ashamed of the thing that I'm aware that I did, the thing that I will want to do is to go run and hide from that. I want to hide from the shame. I will want to hide from the behavior. I will not want to come and say to you, this is what I did. I'm sorry. I'm going to make that confession publicly to you in front of other people that I also hurt. That would be a healthy response to shame, because shame is acting in a proper way as a signal. Where we run into challenges is when shame is actively wielded, and we begin, like, if we grew up in families where people use shame as a weapon, and it doesn't have to, many families, it is used in very, very minor moments, small moments, but it's just, it's the death of 1,000 cuts, in which we have these small moments in which, the boy comes to his dad with the 92% that he's never gotten on his math test. And the dad says, that's great. Where's the other 8%? Right. There's a sense in which, like, if you were to ask the dad would say, yeah, I'm trying to prod him on to doing even better work. The dad's not very aware of what he's doing, but he's shaming his son. And we're not saying that what he's done is he's not taken his son out and publicly stripped him naked and done something horrible to him. But if you grow up in the house where that's the response that I get from my dad every time I bring something to him that is really good, there is going to be a sense in which over and over and over and over again, that becomes like a small toxicity, if you will. And then you go from there to things where we have people who've encountered significant maltreatment, either through neglect or sexual or physical or emotional abuse, where shame just is kind of part of the water that we drink and the air that we breathe. And in those situations, shame becomes so easily embedded within us that we don't even know that it is the air that we don't know that this is how we're operating. And so I begin to interpret and read all kinds of signs and signals when I'm in school, when I'm at church, when I think about God, when I read the scriptures, when I have when I'm trying to date people, when I'm at work. It's just the filter through which I start to understand everything. And it is governing the story that I tell, to the degree that, like, I don't even know that shame is what's governing it. Not until I have burned so much energy trying to contain it and manage it that my system then begins to send me additional signals. I develop panic attacks. I develop obsessive compulsive features. I have other kinds of things that are happening. I find myself, in a pastor's office. I find myself in, a mental health professional's office, and I'm talking about these symptoms that I have. And I'm not really even aware that shame is part of what's going on here until someone starts to ask the kind of questions that no one has asked me. Tell me what it was like growing up in your house. I had this conversation. What it was like growing up in your house? I grew up in a loving Christian home, which means like, well, life really sucked. I just couldn't talk about it. Right? We weren't really allowed to do that. Right? I grew up in a loving Christian home. And then you go, well, tell me who was in charge of discipline in your house? And of course, this is a question this person's never been asked before, right? These are not questions we ask at cocktail parties. Who was in charge of discipline in your house? But when they ask, then they're like, oh my gosh, I guess it was my mom, because anytime my dad got involved, brutality ensued. My dad, who was a deacon in the church. We recognize that the violence that is committed, violence wields shame so easily and quickly and non-verbally that this person wouldn't recognize that the shame is just like embedded in so many parts of what their life is like. And so what we are really trying to do then is to help people identify that shame is present and how am I responding to it? And what does it mean for me to respond to shame in a more appropriate way? Because so many times I'm responding out of shame when I haven't actually done anything, for which shame isn't a thing that I should even be responding to, but it has become so part of my being. And again, Dan, back to your question about the isolation, this is wherein it's going to be hard for me to even be aware that shame is in play until somebody else comes and finds me and starts to ask these kinds of questions.